my opinion, and most likely your opinion, Gintama is home to some of the best arcs in shonen. But that's not the complete picture. Unlike many other shonen, Gintama mostly consists of episodes disattached from any story arc, standalone episodes. And there are a lot of them. Of Gintama's 369 episodes, 226 of them are part of a larger arc, with the remaining 143 episodes being completely self-contained, which is obviously way too long to cover in this video, so instead I'll close it down to my personal top 20. So as a follow-up to my ranking all Gintama arcs video from not too long ago, here are my top 20 favourite standalone episodes. And again, I should make it clear, this is all my own opinion, completely subjective, especially when discussing comedy. Disagreements are bound to occur. So with that being said, let's begin with number 20, episode 100. Being slap bang in the middle of two of my favourite arcs in all of Gintama, you'd think this episode would be more on the forgettable side, but that could not be further from the truth. Here, Gintoki meets Konishi, a Shonen Jump editor responsible for Gintaman, a parody manga of the manga they're currently in, don't ask questions, as Gintoki teams up with Konishi to put a new life into this manga following its recent decline. Parodies are Gintama's forte, and this is no exception. Shonen Jump jokes from start to finish, making this one of the funniest episodes in the series. Dragon Ball, Bleach, Hunter x Hunter, JoJo, nothing is spared from this episode, and it is glorious. It's also one of the most self-aware episodes in the series, not just over fourth wall breaks like Gintoki literally rewinding to earlier in the episode, but also in the sense that it directly criticises the Shonen Jump work ethic. And as a whole, despite being an obviously comedic episode, it does give some insight into the life of a mangaka. As per the infamously demanding nature of Japanese work culture, manga artists have it tough. It's no secret that a lot of the biggest mangakas in the industry suffer or have suffered from mental health issues, having to meet deadline after deadline, illustrating for weeks on end without any breaks. Oh, your manga isn't doing so well? Well, say goodbye to that dream. And in the way of satire, this pressure and brutal competition within the industry comes across pretty well. On the surface, this is just an incredibly funny episode as it is, but its depictions of Shonen Jump work culture is pretty interesting to me. The only criticism I have is that, as with all episodes that strongly parody another anime or manga, it's incredibly black or white. If you don't understand what's being parodied, you won't find it funny, especially with all the Dragon Ball jokes in this one. Oh, and also, the tease at the beginning with the new opening, only for it to be unveiled as a unique Gintaman opening, was a fantastic little gag that acted as the cherry atop the cake, and furthermore, the actual new opening in this episode, Donten, is one of my personal favourites, so that always helps. Number 19, episode 215. Following on from the incredible Kabukicho 4 Divas arc, this episode is pretty unique. One of the only standalone episodes in Gintama to be somewhat grounded and serious. And furthermore, one of the only standalone episodes to not feature Gintoki, Kagura, Shinpachi, the Shinsengumi, pretty much any of our protagonists. Instead, being an episode entirely focused around our antagonists, Takasugi and Kamui. Here, following the defeat of the Harasame and Princess Kada in Kabukicho 4 Divas, Takasugi and Kamui plot to break away from the organisation by teaming up as a new independent faction, leading to some of the more political drama aspects of Gintama we see later on. It's easy to forget that by this point, Takasugi was still an incredibly mysterious character, only ever seen once in a blue moon, and whenever he did appear, he would still tend to lurk in the shadows, rarely appearing in direct combat, like near the end of Gintama. Also, I'm sure some of the budget for Kabukicho 4 Divas was left over for this episode because it looks incredible. No real spectacles of animation, but in terms of the pure art itself, it's a good looking episode to put it lightly. In terms of significance as well, it sets the stage for Takasugi and Kamui's partnership that will go on to underpin the next 100 or so episodes, especially by the time we get to the Shogun Assassination arc. All in all, this episode is great for giving some more long-deserved character development and screen time to some of Gintama's best characters. I always love it when the narrative switches protagonists away from Gintoki and puts someone else in the spotlight for once, as we'll see again later on. Number 18, episode 171. Now, as we'll see from here on out, these explanations will get shorter and shorter because a lot of these episodes aren't all that substantial, just good, well-written comedy. What more can you ask for? This is also one of Gintama's many episodes split into a Part A and a Part B, so let's focus on Part A first. Here, while Gintoki is out and about, two burglars break into Yorozaya in an attempt to rob him in the seemingly abandoned building. Seemingly. You have some great gags here and there as they encounter more and more people. First you have Sachan just being herself, Hasegawa legitimately robbing Gintoki, Tama breaking down his door, and Katsura being the lovable idiot that he is. And just a reminder, he was said to have been a genius in Shokusonjuku. What went wrong? But anyway, this part is completely absurd, not taking itself seriously in the slightest, just what I like to see. The only drawback for me was the abundance of Gundam jokes. I've never seen Gundam nor know anything about it. Obviously that's no one's fault but my own, so there's not much more to say. And then onto Part B, which I think is even funnier. Here, Gintoki, Kagura and Shinpachi suffer from sudden hair loss as a result of an Amanto virus in Kabukicho, and it's these kind of comedy segments that are often most entertaining. When all of the action takes place within Yorozaya, there's something comfortable and nostalgic when the entire episode takes place within the Yorozaya building itself, within that familiar setting of Gintoki's office. I don't know if it's just me who thinks this, but episodes like these are almost always fantastic. You also had classic Gintama fourth wall breaks as per usual, the whole gag with the wigs, and the changes to the opening were also hilarious, my personal highlight of the episode. It's funny to me how Gintama is so self-aware that we as the audience gradually become nulled to just how ridiculous some of this stuff is. Ultimately, a great episode. Number 17, episode 293. Probably the only episode in all of Gintama where our protagonist is Kondo, certainly a welcome surprise, although over 290 episodes into the series, it's a bit of a shock that it took this long for him to take centre stage in an episode. Obviously he's one of the most pivotal characters in the core plot of Gintama, but when comparing to Hijikata and Okita, both of which have whole arcs dedicated to them as protagonists, Kondo meanwhile has always felt a bit left out. Here we get our first glimpse into Kondo's childhood, while also explaining the long-term gorilla gag that dominates his character. As a child, he was a bit of a notorious troublemaker, a lonely child resorting to petty crimes in order to survive, until being taken under the wing of Etakichi Kozo. After this, he would go on to study and live at a temple school worshipping some sort of monkey deity, hence his nickname, until eventually being attacked and burnt down with the aforementioned temple master, Kozo, seemingly disappearing until we go back to the present. The first half of the episode with Kondo and the old man, who we later learn to be Kozo, is the comedic part of the episode. You have Kondo as a criminal evading the police, of which I might remind you, he is the commander of, as he accidentally assaults Hijikata over and over again until getting away. This first half is such a classic Gintama premise, having a character in literally the worst possible situation, the head of the secret police, evading capture from said secret police. Does it make any logical sense? No, but bringing logic to the table is the first mistake you can make when talking about Gintama. For a character who's been noticeably backstory shy compared with many others, it's fantastic to see, better late than never, and serve to fully expand on his character before his major role in the upcoming Farewell Shinsengumi arc. And as a one-off side character, Kozo was also pretty well done. His death at the end was genuinely emotional, despite the fact we only learnt of his existence about 20 minutes beforehand, a fantastic minor character given his incredibly short screen time. Number 16, episode 48. Another ridiculous Part A Part B episode from pretty early on in the series. In fact, a lot of these episodes will be from the first 100, considering how later on, Gintama becomes much more arc-based and moves away from these kind of standalone episodes. But anyway now, starting with Part A, which involves a group of assassins tasked with the murder of Hijikata, following him around on his day off, only to be foiled by getting in the crossfire between Hijikata and Gintoki, with them being none the wiser. In all three scenarios, they attempt to assassinate Hijikata, but of course, with this being Gintama, nothing goes to plan, as Hijikata and Gintoki keep accidentally subverting their plans, unaware of the assassination attempts in the first place. Much like the last couple episodes, the premise alone guarantees a great episode. It's classic subversion of expectations. You have what would otherwise be a somewhat dark and gritty synopsis transformed into something much more comedic, and it's fantastic. And then moving on to part B, which exchanges comedy for wholesomeness, focusing mainly on Kagura and the supposed ghost of Zenzo's late father, playing one big game of kick the can before he can move on to the afterlife. Yeah, it does sound a lot weirder saying it out loud. But regardless, this part is simply just heartwarming, focusing on the idea that even as an adult, your childish nature never truly goes away. Sure, it may be a simple classic shonen message, but it's heartwarming and I'm a bit of a sucker for these kind of wholesome episodes. All in all, there's not a whole lot to this episode and there doesn't need to be. A good example of simple but effective, with great comedic moments and a comfortable feel-good ending. This episode is definitely a forgotten gem. Number 15, episode 65. Again, who would have guessed, another ridiculous plot and probably one of the most recognisable episodes in the first 100. Possibly in part due to its live action adaptation, because it's the Golden Beetle episode. Here, after the death of Kagura's PS1 model Beetle, she sets out to capture another one as a replacement. It's then found out that a rare species of highly valuable beetle live locally, and of course Gintoki joins her, with Shinpachi being dragged along with them. Eventually they cross paths with the Shinsengumi, who are also on the hunt for a valuable beetle, specifically the golden pet beetle of the Shogun, which they've been tasked with capturing before someone else such as, I don't know, Gintoki perhaps, does the same. And of course, predictably, it's absolute carnage. You have Yorozora and the Shinsengumi fighting over who can get their hands on the beetle the first, with the gag at the end of Gintoki stepping on it and killing it being the highlight, completely unexpected. In true Gintama fashion, this episode is weird. Really, really weird. Which is probably why it's so unforgettable for me. It's comfortable, simple entertainment, nothing more, nothing less, encapsulating the sheer absurdity of Gintama as a whole. And as I said, there's not a whole lot to dissect here. I mean, what you see is what you get. Great expectation-defying comedy, not a serious moment to be seen, a funny episode no doubt. Number 14, episode 83. Here, all of the hostesses have suddenly come down with an illness at Kabukicho's hostess bar, leaving Otai as the only one available to serve an upcoming VIP guest scheduled for the next day. In response, Gintoki and Co work to gather as many people as possible to replace those ill as eligible hostesses for this special guest, eventually forming a mismatched group of the worst hostesses possible because of course, for this VIP arrival later that day. And then we see why this episode is so significant. The special guest is none other than the legend himself, the Shogun, being his first official appearance of many more to come. And if this show has taught us anything, any episode involving the Shogun, irregardless of context, is always a fantastic episode. Especially during the Shogun game they play in the second half, absolute comedy gold. This poor man always finding himself in the worst possible situations is a treat to behold, and it's no wonder these Shogun-based episodes became a running gag. This was the first to do it, and in my opinion, one of the best. Again, the premise of this episode feeds into what I was saying for the Kondo episode earlier, a classic Gintama premise of literally the worst possible scenario somehow occurring, to the point where it's so utterly unbelievable that it doesn't even matter. Why should it? Ultimately, this was a bit of a toss-up between choosing either this episode or the swimming episode with the Shogun much later on, but the fact that this episode was the first to do it, introducing one of the most beloved side characters in Gintama, in my opinion, is more deserving of a spot in this video. Another fantastic episode. Number 13, episode 72. Back to another part A, part B style of episode now, so as per usual, let's start with part A. Here, Sadaharu has a crush on a dog he meets in the park, resulting in Yorozora taking him to some sort of dog meet-up socializing event. The interactions between Gintoki and Hasegawa, and especially between Ketsunohana, make for some of the funniest parts of the episode. Perfect expectation-defying comedy, Gintoki fanboying over Ketsunohana is always a sight to see. We then eventually learn that Sadaharu's crush, Meru-chan, happens to be owned by that one side villain that always shows up, but no matter how many times I see him, I always forget his name, otherwise known as Katsuo, as the two of them fight over their dogs in the middle of the lake. It's stupid, fun, and most importantly, entertaining, with some of the gags like Hasegawa's mechanical dog being top notch. All in all, a pretty strong part A, but not quite as strong as part B, mainly because it features the lovable idiot himself, Katsura. Here, Katsura attempts to rent out a movie from his local store, however, in order to complete the transaction, he needs some form of ID of which he doesn't have, resulting in him attempting to obtain a driver's license, coincidentally alongside Gintoki. Obviously, Katsura plus doing anything equals comedy gold, with this being a prime example, making fun of the whole what if scenarios in driving tests and taking it to its utmost extreme, like what if they had a bomb in the car, because why not? It's classic slapstick humour with Gintoki and Katsura bouncing off each other perfectly. Katsura does something dumb, Gintoki tries to sort him out, and the cycle continues. Again, it's stupid from start to finish, but I can't help but love it. You had some fantastic gags from start to finish, like Katsura's overly complex 10-hour scenario of the family, and Katsura giving up and using his own wanted poster as a form of ID. All in all, a fantastic, evenly balanced episode that again I feel is a bit of a forgotten gem. Number 12, episode 153. Remember earlier how I said that I was a fan of comedy episodes that focused more on small-scale interactions within Yorozuya, like the audience is just peeking into the building at their daily lives? Well, this is the epitome of that. In this episode, Kagura can't get to sleep, and that's it. That's the entire synopsis. Who knew it could make for such a fantastic episode? But also makes it pretty tough to talk about. It's certainly not the most complex episode Gintama has to offer. It's a good old-fashioned slice-of-life episode. Gintoki is awoken by Kagura in the middle of the night and demands him to do anything he can to put her to sleep, but predictably, no matter what he tries, Kagura continues to stay awake. This is a good example to other shonen that entertainment doesn't always have to be a spectacle. This style of small-scale confined episodes, mostly centered around dialogue instead of visuals, work absolute wonders, and as a whole, it's one of Gintama's best attributes. The highlight of this episode is of course the infamous radio scene. Gintoki listens to a radio story about a young girl and her dog. On the surface, an emotional story about the death of this beloved dog, only for it to give you the biggest middle finger in all of Gintama with that jump scare. Because I myself have a dog I absolutely adore, I was quite heavily invested in the story, and first time round I'm pretty sure I must have been checking my phone or doing something else when the jump scare occurred, and thank God I did, because otherwise I think I might have been traumatized. Whether in a comedic sense or a more serious sense, Gintama has always been an anime that has perfected the art of defying expectations, and this is a fantastic example. Not one single part of me expected this scene, it took me completely off guard, and for that, it's definitely one of the most memorable standalone episodes to be seen. But ultimately, I've waffled on for long enough about this episode. To me, this episode is an easy, comfortable slice of entertainment. The type of episode where no matter what kind of headspace you're in, you can always sit down and enjoy it. That's gotta count for something. Number 11, episode 113. Again, another one of the most notorious standalone episodes in Gintama. Here we meet Seizo, a new member of the Shinsengumi, obsessed with keeping the headquarters as clean as possible in order to stop the spread of germs within the Shinsengumi. If only we had him these last few years. I've said it before, but toilet humour is usually a bit of a red flag for me. Now, I'm not gonna pretend to be above immature childish humour like this, but you gotta admit, occasionally it does go a little too far. However, alongside episode 79 of the Yagyu arc, this is toilet humour done well. Is it completely immature? Oh, absolutely. In essence, Seizo gives the ability for Okuta and Hijikata to see the germs around them, resulting in the trio finding new ways to make sure the toilets are kept as clean as possible, leading to some less than holy methods. This episode is filled with some great gags like Hijikata's face being used on the urinals and the iconic Kondo scene, which, having seen this gif all over the place, no context probably makes a lot more sense than actually having context in this instance. But with that being said, what is there more to say? The second half is definitely much less funny than the first half, but all in all, the first half makes up for it. One of the most immature, yet admittedly brilliant episodes in Gintama. Number 10, episode 112. Going back just a single episode before the last one, we have another incredible episode. Another one that I don't believe gets the love it deserves. Focusing almost entirely around Tama and her integration with Yorozuya and the others. In my possibly unpopular opinion, Tama is one of the funniest characters in the series, and with this being her first episode as a new recurring side character, it can only promise something amazing. In this episode, unsure as to how to relax, Tama joins Gintoki for a day out in town. Most of the comedy comes from her trying to adapt into society and adhere to social norms, but of course, misinterpreting all that Gintoki says and only making each situation worse, especially the host club scene being the highlight of the episode. Again, simple but effective. You don't need these overly ridiculous premises to build a good comedic episode. All you need is creativity, and this episode has plenty of it. Tama's literal interpretation of all that she hears is such a fantastic gag. Seeing her quite literally describe her purpose in the host bar honestly makes for one of the funniest scenes in all of Gintama for me, and as a whole, this episode is head to toe with fantastic visual comedy, like her drinking a gallon of oil or unwinding her head off during a massage. And then the ending is surprisingly wholesome and emotional, seeing her finally understand what it means to be happy as an individual instead of only knowing how to please others. It's a nice touching ending that you don't normally see in a purely comedic episode like this. Ultimately, this episode has a good balance of fantastic comedic scenes as well as being a good opportunity to build up Tama's character and properly establish what we can expect from her going forward. The only major criticism I have is that the episode did feel a tad dragged out at times. This episode was most likely just a single chapter in the manga, so they had to find some way to drag it out to an entire episode, which is fair enough, and they did it pretty well regardless. Especially with the whole Katsura Tama parody opening celebrating Katsura's birthday, a neat little inclusion. Number 9, episode 231. Any episode involving ghosts, or more specifically, any episode involving Gintoki getting scared, always makes for some of the best humour. The fact that a child of war raised on the battlefield like Gintoki and the so-called demon vice commander of the government secret police are genuinely afraid of ghosts is genius. In this episode, following the death of a local restaurant owner regularly visited by both Gintoki and Hijikata, our two trios of Yorozuya and the Shinsengumi attend his funeral to pay their respects. However, it soon takes a sudden turn when the owner's ghost begins to manifest, appearing invisible to all but Gintoki and Hijikata, scared out of their minds with the rest being none the wiser. Again, it's another completely stupid premise that just works. Fear is a fantastic catalyst for comedy, and this is a perfect example. It's so outlandish and unbelievable that it becomes hilarious. In particular, not an ounce of my being expected them to literally break their own arms in order to get out of carrying the coffin. Such a simple gag, but for me, the highlight of the episode for sure. Despite being about a funeral, there is not a single, even remotely serious aspect to this episode. It's easy to see why. This is probably one of the most recognisable standalone episodes in Gintama. Gintama and the supernatural always results in an incredible episode, as we'll see again a bit later on. But as a whole, one of the funniest episodes, no doubt. Amazing facial expressions, which is pretty impressive by Gintama standards, and ultimately another inoffensive, rich slice of pure, unfiltered entertainment. What more could you possibly want? Number 8, episode 166. This episode is pretty similar to the last one, both featuring Gintoki and Hijikata at the centre, with a whole lot of screaming. But unlike the last one, or almost any of the ones in this video for that matter, Interestingly enough, this is actually a filler episode. In anime, especially in shonen, the term filler has some pretty bad connotations of lazy, unoriginal, and downright boring episodes, and a lot of the time, for good reason. But this is no such example, probably the best filler episode in anime from what I've seen personally. The appeal of this one is one and the same as the last: stupid antics between Hijikata and Gintoki. In this episode, after Gintoki interferes with a police investigation, he's arrested, but Okita, being the sadist he is, handcuffs him to Hijikata, and the rest is history. You have some fantastic gags here and there, like them ballroom dancing into the restaurant and the whole toilet laxative dilemma. The fact that that was all filler truly shows how much Sunrise must have been passionate about Gintama, because this episode is indistinguishable from any other. Also, the fight scene at the end between the two and the Joy Rebels is actually pretty unique and inventive when you take some time to analyse it. Seeing them in combat while handcuffed and what they can do to overcome this handicap, like using the chains as if it was a shield. Definitely an overlooked part of this episode. Ultimately, this is some classic Gintoki Hijikata fanservice. They knew what they were doing when creating this episode. There's not a whole lot more to say, another fantastic episode to say the least. Number 7, episode 175. And would you look at that, it's another Gintoki Hijikata episode, this time at the dentist, taking a fairly mundane run-of-the-mill situation, flipping it on its head and making it one of the weirdest episodes in the show. Here, Gintoki and Hijikata both turn up at the same dentist, unwilling to admit how scared they are even as adults, resulting in a sort of Death Note-esque mind game between the two, both trying their best to not show any signs of weakness to the other. As I said, personally, comedy is best fueled by fear. Any episode involving characters being scared out of their minds is a treat to behold, with this of course being no exception. The mind games at the start, with them both trying to one-up each other, being a fantastic example. This episode is basically the dentist taken to the ultimate extreme, like Hasegawa having a heart attack mid-operation and coming out with a toothbrush as his arm for some reason. It's absurd. Why is this happening, and who cares? The clinic room scene itself is also equally hilarious. Some great visual gags like the blood splattered on the ground and the weapons on the wall, painting it out as a torture chamber, while Gintoki and Hijikata are attended by these dentist Gundam mechs, again don't ask questions, making for the funniest part of the episode, classic denial of expectations. The whole dilemma between choosing Nakayama, only for Nakayama to be one of the mechs, and then both of them are, as you can tell, it's incredibly hard to explain, you have to rewatch it for yourself. All in all, this episode is an absolute goldmine of laughter. Another example of our cast being put in literally the worst possible scenario once again, with their constant flipping back and forth between confidence on the outside and terror on the inside being incredible. It's weird, it's wacky, it's wonderful, a true Gintama experience. Number 6, episode 111. Another episode split into a part A and a part B, of which we'll mostly be talking about just part B. Part A, meanwhile, is just classic Gintama comedy, pretty decent, but it probably wouldn't make it into this video if it were to be an independent episode itself. But part B is one of the most wholesome, heartwarming parts of the entire show, focusing mainly on Kagura and her obsession with a new umbrella, so that she can have fun in the rain, taking some time out from the likes of Shinpachi and Gintoki. In my opinion, one of the best elements of characterization within Gintama is its depiction of teenagers, Shinpachi but especially Kagura, because as a whole I cannot stand the typical teenage archetype you see in shonen, where I feel they're overly romanticised, portrayed as these strong inspirational figures for the more often than not likewise teenage audience, which is fantastic from an entertainment perspective, but not exactly realistic, acting as a perfect anime character instead of the largely imperfect nature of human beings. Whereas in Gintama, I feel Kagura especially is a lot more human. She's 14, of course she's gonna be immature, act on impulses, and as a whole, just wanna have fun like any young teenager would want, which is perfectly exemplified in this episode, making the most of what she has and in doing so further building up her character. Again, it's common in anime for teenagers to to be so angsty and quote-unquote cool to actually show some recognisable imperfections like being jealous, being stubborn, being sad, etc. This is a pretty touching episode, all things considered, especially the scenes of Kagero donating her homemade umbrella to the orphans, and that final scene under the broken umbrella with Gintoki and Shinpachi as well. Sure, maybe this episode might be a tad high up in this video, considering I don't particularly care much for part A, but I've already finalised the script and made all the assets, so here it is. But regardless, either way you slice it, this episode belongs in this video for sure. Number 5, episode 273. And would you look at that, back again for another Gintoki Hijikata episode, once again centered around literally the worst possible situation to be in. Here, Hijikata is given a lottery ticket, which turns out to hold the winning number, worth 300 million yen, or about $2.5 million. Once in the possession of this winning ticket, Hijikata starts to see the world from a different perspective, thanks to his paranoia, assuming all those around him to be criminals in pursuit of his winning ticket. Even though I've never seen Fist of the North Star, this parody was fantastic. And it only gets better when he runs into none other than Gintoki, who we learn is in fact the rightful owner of this winning ticket after a mix-up at the shop, resulting in this internal game of cat and mouse between the two as to who is the legitimate owner. And once again, we have some beautiful, expectation-defying comedy, with Hijikata stuck in his hallucinated fantasy world, and Gintoki remaining in reality, as they're chased down the streets of Edo by quote-unquote hitmen on their way to redeem the ticket at the bank. And then you have the scenes with the criminals. Again, a classic Gintama concept of what would be an otherwise pretty serious and grounded situation being completely flipped on its head, with Gintoki accidentally robbing a bank and Hijikata accidentally attacking the police of which he is a part of. This episode is peak Gintama comedy, and definitely my favourite standalone comedy episode from the 16:9 HD era of Gintama. It's so ridiculous and unbelievable that it's just easy to sit back and enjoy it, no concentration required, just stupid simple fun. The whole gag at the end of Gintoki giving his sentimental speech on how stupid it is that a tiny scrap of paper can so significantly impact someone's life, with Hijikata eventually ripping it up, only to find out Gintoki is instead running off with the stolen money, is just perfect. How can you not like this episode? Number 4, and right back to the start, it's episode 25. Now I distinctly remember this was essentially the episode that sold me on Gintama, one of the first episodes that truly had me dying, and the first episode to let me know that I was in for the long run and wouldn't be dropping the series anytime soon. Much like the aforementioned Kagura sleeping episode, this episode is incredibly self-contained and small scale, focusing on a single hot pot and who gets to eat it first. And that's literally it for the synopsis. The whole episode is just about how they share out their meal. This episode is a blatant parody of the melodrama you see in those mind battles between Light and L in Death Note, which of course at this point in 2006 would have been the hot new show, so obviously Gintama takes first dibs to parody it. And it is incredible, again taking the overly dramatic monologues of Death Note and applying it to the most stupid of stupid situations, seeing them all impersonate Light's cunning and manipulative character, but not in the context of purging the world's criminals, but instead just sitting down to have a nice meal, is amazing. We all know Gintama is the king of parodies, and this is a perfect example. If anything, it's a shame we never really saw Death Note parodied ever again after this episode. These dialogue-centered episodes are some of the most underrated episodes in Gintama. More so than any other, this episode for sure deserves way more love than it actually gets. Again, it's this contrast between how dumb the actual situation is and the psychological warfare between each other, acting as if their life depends on it, being what I find so funny. With the evil Death Note-esque facial expressions and Ryuk's cameo right at the end, topping off a fantastic episode. Number 3, episode 119. one of the most recognizable episodes in Gintama. Here, Hijikata is faced with a nationwide ban on smoking, forcing him to adapt his way of life accordingly after constant stigma from those around him. We see Hijikata wander the streets of Edo on a lookout for a place to smoke in peace, but no matter where he looks, smoking is now widely frowned upon, resulting in him going slightly insane after being denied any opportunity on Earth. And speaking of insanity, I present to you the rest of the episode. Of all of the many anime, manga and pop culture parodies we see in Gintama, none seem to be done better than good old DBZ parodies, with this being the absolute epitome. As much as I don't really care about it nowadays, Dragon Ball was my introduction into the world of anime and manga when I was about 7 or 8 years old, so needless to say, it holds a special place in my heart, and seeing Gintama make fun of Dragon Ball and a lot of its infamous elements is incredible to see. Yet again, it's this contrast between what would otherwise be incredibly grounded and serious, and Gintama flipping it on its head. You have Goku's fight against Frieza in the original, one of the most dramatic but drawn out moments of DBZ, with the notorious 5 minutes line. And then we have the complete satire of Gintama, taking what was originally a 19 episode long fight and condensing it into, 5 seconds? All because Hijikata wants a cigarette, which somehow results in him living about 200 episodes of DBZ, because of course it does. It's just scene after scene of incredible parodies that all build onto each other, condensing the entire Namek saga of DBZ into about 10 minutes, poking fun at certain parts like the overly drawn out recaps and the ridiculously long fight scenes. This is another episode that you can watch at any time and always get a laugh out of it. It never grows old hearing the tragic tale of the Namekian genocide, but from such a stupid perspective of a man who just wants a smoke. This is, without question, my favourite parody episode in Gintama. As I said, it is peak satire, absolutely ripping DBZ apart and putting it in the most stupid of contexts. A man who just wants a smoke, ending up collecting the Dragon Balls and summoning the dragon. What's not to love? Number 2, episode 20. Much like the aforementioned episode 25, this is one of the earliest episodes in Gintama that properly invested me in the series. In fact, this little section of episode 20 to episode 29 have some of the most underrated episodes in all of Gintama, and I'd highly recommend you to rewatch some of them. But anyway now, the latter half of this video has been dominated with Gintoki Hijikata episodes, like the lottery ticket one and the one at the dentist, but for me at least, this one in particular is the most recognisable of the bunch. In this episode, Hijikata and the rest of the Shinsengumi hear of a certain ghostly legend, a tale about a woman in a red kimono cursing all those she encounters. As such, Yorozaya show up in flawless Team Rocket disguises, claiming to be exorcists. And then, once again, like at the dentist, what follows is Gintoki and Hijikata, two men with the biggest egos on the planet, trying their best to uphold their prideful, confident persona, when in reality, they are, of course, scared to death. Once again, it's the mind games between the two that kills me, both of them unwilling to admit their fears until directly faced with them, making for some of the funniest gags of the episode, like Okata teasing them into instantly hiding, and the whole scene by the pond at the end. But again, what is there more to say? What you see is what you get. Gintoki and Hijikata scared out of their minds is always a golden formula. We've established that so far. Personally, it's one of the most expectation-defying, ridiculous episodes in Gintama. And the main reason this episode is above some of the similar ones so far is that it was the first to do it, the first to establish this type of Gintoki Hijikata-centered episode as a common motif to be seen going forward. And as I said, this episode doesn't get nearly the love it deserves. And finally, I'm sure a lot of people saw this one coming, and for good reason, because it's number 1, episode 188. Now, I know I'm guilty of using the same idioms all the time in these videos, like saying something simple but effective, but this episode more so than any other, actually is the epitome of simple but effective. Here we follow a young boy by the name of Daigoro and his encounter with Hasegawa, with the latter being this episode's protagonist and of course the highlights of the episode. So let's examine Hasegawa's character and take a step back as to why his portrayal in this episode works so well. Hasegawa is predominantly a vehicle for comedy. It's no secret that his main purpose in Gintama is that of comic relief. However, this is an episode that completely subverts that ideal. In fact, the subversion of expectations is, in my opinion, what underpins the success of Gintama's writing. In the sense that by using comedy, Sorachi is incredible at establishing a character in a particular way, like Gintoki and Kagura both being these jovial, immature, larger-than-life figures, only for the audience perception to be completely flipped on its head at certain points in the show. And this is a similar situation. By this point in the show, Hasegawa has almost been entirely there just for comedy, so we were never given a true insight into his character. He is a desperate man rejected by society and forced to live on the sidelines. Here he is found by Daigoro and adopted into the family alongside Daigoro's mother, who'd recently split from her alcoholic husband who'd been cheating on her after a violent argument, resulting in Hasegawa adopting that role within the family. We see Hasegawa not as a stereotypical anime character, but as a human being. He is a genuinely kind and good man in pursuit of a new life, away from alcohol and depression, and instead towards employment and prosperity. With the ending being the epitome of this good nature, giving up his potential job for another man who turns out to be Daigoro's father, so that they can live in harmony at the expense of his own well-being. He was climbing the mountain but decided to jump off just meters from the top. As I've said before, Gintama is not a traditional shonen in its storytelling. In most shonen, doing something good typically results in a reward of some sort, a romanticized sentiment of no matter how hard you try, you'll always get there in the end because your efforts are always rewarded. But in Gintama, and in reality, it's not that simple. Just because you do something good, it doesn't mean you'll get anything out of it. An incredibly bleak notion, echoed in Hasegawa. You have genuinely good people, shackled by the infamously competitive nature of Japanese work culture. And as a whole, this episode is probably a comment on just that, criticising Japanese society and the lack of any social mobility. Hasegawa is a Madao and continues to stay that way because society won't permit him to move upwards. But ultimately, Hasegawa is presented as a socially benevolent and selfless man. His characterization in this episode is unlike anything else we've seen of him by that point. Sure, he might not be the perfect shonen-esque character, but in that regard, his imperfections make him even more believable. This episode speaks volumes about Hideaki Sorachi's skills when it comes to writing. This episode doesn't even mention Gintoki or any of our main cast, instead focusing on Hasegawa, a periodic comic relief side character, yet he still feels more complex than some shonen protagonists. What more can I say? Clearly the best standalone episode in Gintama. So, there we go. Didn't think I'd be making another list style video anytime soon, given how long it took to make the last one, but regardless, here we are once again. But with that being said, I've done all of the talking so far. Now, I'm interested to see what you all think. Because again, especially with a topic as volatile as comedy, there is a monumental degree of subjectivity. I can assure you some of the picks in this video are some people's least favourite episodes. So if you think I missed any hidden gem, perhaps tell me in the comment section below. But with all that out of the way, I'll be back in the next one. See ya!